They didn't know he was listening. That was their first mistake. Vera Holt stood at the counter at Callahan's Grain and Feed, counting out crumpled bills for feed she could barely afford. While behind her, three men leaned against a truck bed, laughing loud enough to fill the whole parking lot. 90 acres of nothing, one of them said. That woman's out there talking dirt that quit listening years ago. She didn't turn around. She'd heard worse. She'd hear worse again before the week was out. But 20 feet away, near the diesel pumps, a man in a battered ball cap went very, very still. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't even looking at her anymore. He was staring past her, out toward the ridge where her land began, like he'd just seen something the entire county had missed for 10 straight years. Nobody in that parking lot knew his name was about to end up on every front page in 3 counties. Nobody knew that by Friday, the man laughing loudest would be the one who couldn't look Vera Holt in the eye. And nobody, least of all Vera, had any idea that the worthless 90 acres behind her house was about to make her one of the richest widows in the state. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to where it started. If you've ever been counted out before anyone bothered to ask why, stay with this one till the very end, because what Grant Weller found on that land is going to stop you in your tracks. Hit subscribe, drop a like, and tell us where in the world you're watching from tonight. We read every single one. Vera Holt was 46 years old, and she'd buried her husband Tom 2 winters back, on a rise overlooking the barn his own father had raised with a borrowed team of mules. She still climbed up there some evenings, not to grieve exactly, but to remember the ground below had once meant something more than a debt she couldn't outrun. The farm, 92 acres outside the small town of Millbrook Fork, had fed half the county in Tom's grandfather's time. Now it barely fed the two of them, Vera and her 16-year-old son, Caleb. 3 seasons of failed corn behind them. A tractor that hadn't turned over since spring. A bank that called on the first of every month like clockwork. The voice on the other end long past pretending to be sorry. Vera wasn't helpless. She could read a soil report better than half the men who mocked her. She'd nursed calves through fever with nothing but a heat lamp and stubbornness. But there's only so much a person can outwork when the land itself seems to have turned its back on her, except for one stretch. Along the back fence line, past an old stand of cottonwoods, the pasture stayed a deep, defiant green even in the driest weeks of July, when everything around it had gone the color of dust. Vera hadn't noticed it for years. She'd never had the time or the money to ask why. The talk in Millbrook Fork had been building for months, the way it does in towns small enough that a person's misfortune becomes everyone's entertainment. At the diner, at church, in line at the post office. The Holt place had become shorthand for a lesson people like repeating. Proof, they said, that some land simply isn't meant to come back. Harlan Dietz, who ran the co-op, was the loudest about it. She should have sold 2 years ago, he told anyone who'd listen. Save herself the heartbreak. Then there was Nolan Vance, a land buyer from 3 counties over, sharp suit, softer voice, who'd already made Vera 2 offers, each one lower than the last. Each one delivered with the patience of a man who already knew how this story was supposed to end. Vera never signed anything, but standing in her kitchen after his last visit, staring at a number that wouldn't even cover what she owed, she'd felt something close to the floor giving out beneath her. And now, outside the feed store, the word had finally landed the way words sometimes do, all at once impossible to unhear. She thanked the clerk, walked to her truck with her spine straight, and didn't let a single tear fall until she was 4 miles down the road, alone, with no one left to perform strength for. The man by the diesel pumps had a name most of the county already knew, Grant Weller. He'd built Weller Ranching from 600 acres his father left him into nearly 14,000 spread across 3 counties, the kind of wealth that made other men in Millbrook Fork quietly recalculate their own worth. But Grant didn't wear it the way people expected. He still drove a truck with a dented tailgate he kept meaning to fix. His hands were scarred from 30 years of fence work he never once handed off to someone else. People respected Grant Weller not for what he owned, but for what he knew. He could look at a stretch of pasture and tell you, within a season, exactly what was wrong with it, and more often than not, exactly how to fix it. He'd heard Harlan's comment same as everyone else in that lot. Said nothing. That wasn't his way. But he'd watched Vera Holt's reflection in the store window, watched her absorb the insult without giving anyone the satisfaction or reaction, and something about that quiet refusal to break stayed with him longer than the joke itself. What stayed with him more was what he'd noticed driving past her property the week before, that stripe of impossible green along her back fence, cutting through pasture that should have been dead brown like everything else in a summer drought. He'd clocked it the way 30 years of reading land had trained his eye to, without meaning to, without being able to stop. Now, watching her taillights disappear down the county road, he found he couldn't stop thinking about it either. Why would one strip of ground refuse to die with the rest of it? He climbed into his truck, and instead of turning toward home, he pointed it straight toward the Holt place, with no idea yet just how much that green stripe of grass was about to change everyone's life in Millbrook Fork. He didn't go that first day. Grant Weller had learned a long time ago that showing up uninvited on another person's land, however good his intentions, was the fastest way to be shown the gate. So he called ahead instead, told Vera plainly he'd noticed some unusually green grass along her back fence in the road, and asked if he could take a look, curious whether her drainage ran anywhere near his own property downhill. It wasn't entirely true. It wasn't entirely false either, and it gave Vera a reason to say yes that didn't feel like charity. She met him at the gate the next morning, wary in a particular way of someone who'd been made promises before. Grant didn't waste her time with small talk. He walked the fence line slowly, crouching every few yards, rubbing the dry pasture grass between his fingers, comparing color and texture the way another man might study paint samples. "How long's the stretch stayed green in dry months?" he asked. "Long as I can remember," Vera said. "Tom used to say it was just low ground." "Low ground holds water after rain," Grant said. "It doesn't hold water 4 weeks into a drought with no rain at all." He crouched near an old stone rise at the edge of the cottonwoods, brushing back overgrown grass, to reveal weathered rocks stacked with more intention than nature would ever manage on its own. "This isn't a natural outcrop," he said. "Somebody built this." "It's just an old wall," Vera said. "Been there since before Tom's grandfather." "Maybe," Grant said. "Or maybe it's not a wall at all." He asked if he could dig, just a shallow test hole. Vera, more curious now than trusting, said yes. 18 inches down, his shovel struck something that wasn't rock and wasn't root. Clay pipe. Hand-fired. The kind farmers laid 100 years ago when they wanted to move water somewhere on purpose. "Somebody engineered this ground," Grant said quietly, almost himself. "This whole section was built to hold and move water. It still is." Vera stood over the trench, staring at a piece of buried pipe that had apparently been doing its quiet work for a century without a single soul noticing, including her. Grant came back 3 more times that week, and each visit peeled back another layer. A second run of clay pipe, curving southeast beneath an overgrown fence line, a shallow depression in the far pasture that, once he studied the slope, could only be the collapsed remains of an old holding pond, a reservoir built to catch runoff and gravity feed it across acres that hadn't seen consistent water in longer than Vera had been alive. Tom's grandfather built an entire irrigation system, Grant told her, standing over a county plat map he'd borrowed from the courthouse. Gravity fed. No pumps needed, which means no fuel cost, no electric cost. He tapped a faded surveyor's note in the corner. Improved acreage irrigated, dated decades back. This was one of the most productive parcels in the county, once. So what happened? Vera asked. That was the real question. And Grant didn't have an answer yet. He found the first real clue 2 days later, in the county records office. A permit, filed nearly 15 years back, requesting a modification to water rights along Miller's Creek, the same waterway that had once fed that buried pipe system. Approved. The name on the filing wasn't Holt. It was Vance. Vera's mortgage note came due at the worst possible time, the way these things always seem to. The bank had extended her twice already, and the loan officer's voice on the phone carried the flatness of a man reading from a script he didn't enjoy. 90 days, he told her. 90 days, or foreclosure proceedings would begin. Nolan Vance showed up 2 days after that call, driving his clean white truck up her gravel drive with an offer already printed and folded in his jacket pocket, like he'd been waiting for exactly this moment. He was polite. patient, told her he understood how hard this must be, and that he only wanted to help her avoid something worse. Vera didn't sign, but standing in her kitchen after he left, staring at a number that wouldn't cover her debts and would erase every trace of Tom's family from that ground, she felt for the first time the true weight of losing. Grant drove out that evening and found her sitting on the porch steps, the offer sheet still in her hand. "That water rights filing," he said, sitting down beside her without asking permission, the way old friends do, even when they've only recently become friends at all. "It was filed by a company called Miller Creek Holdings. Took me a while to trace who's behind it. It's him, Vera. It's Vance." She looked up. "He didn't just want her land cheap," Grant said. "He diverted your water upstream 15 years ago, before Tom's family even realized what they'd lost. Cut the flow to your whole irrigation system down to almost nothing. Your land didn't fail on its own. Somebody starved it. The betrayal of that truth was its own kind of grief, sharper, somehow, than watching a farm simply wither from bad luck. Someone had wanted this outcome. Someone had engineered her humiliation as carefully as Tom's grandfather had once engineered that irrigation system. And with that, something else fell into place. The summers Tom had spent hauling water tanks out the back pasture by truck, always brushing off her questions with a tired joke about a dry stretch that never seemed to end. He must have known. He'd simply refused to let her see how hard he was working to hide it. "So what do I do with that?" she asked. "I still the bank in 90 days. Grant was quiet a long moment, looking out over the darkening fields. "We don't need 90 days to prove what this land can do," he said. "We need results, fast enough that the bank sees them before that number ever comes due." The first setback arrived within a week. A summer storm rolled through with more wind than rain, and it tore loose the temporary pump line Grant had helped rig from the creek to prime the old gravity system, while the water rights case worked its way through the county. 2 days of work, undone in an afternoon. Vera stood in the mud afterward, staring at broken pipe and fittings, feeling the old despair creep back in. "Maybe they're right," she said quietly. "Maybe this land just doesn't want to be saved." Grant didn't offer comfort. He offered a fix. "Ground's not the problem," he said, already crouching to inspect the broken coupling. "This fitting's cheap plastic. Wrong choice for creek-fed pressure. My mistake, not yours. We rebuild it with galvanized joints this time and bury the line 18 inches instead of leaving it exposed." They rebuilt it together, the two of them, and increasingly Caleb, who'd started coming home from school and heading straight to the fields instead of his room. Slowly, water began moving again through channels that had sat dry for 15 years. The change came in increments too small for anyone but Vera to notice at first. A strip of pasture near the old stone rise green thicker than she'd ever seen it. Then a second strip, where Grant had helped her till in a cover crop of clover to rebuild soil that had been starved of both water and organic matter for far too long. By the 6th week, 6 acres of cracked brown earth had become a rolling carpet of green. Vera brought her small remaining herd to graze it in tight rotated sections, moving them every few days instead of wearing one pasture down to nothing. For the first time in years, she watched her cattle gain weight instead of merely surviving. The county water board hearing landed on a Thursday morning in a community hall that doubled as Millbrook Fork's only real gathering space. Half the town found a reason to be there. Vera sat up front with Caleb beside her, in a plain blue dress, an expression that had nothing performative in it at all, just quiet, earned steadiness. Grant sat one row back, close enough to be present, far enough to let it belong to her. The county official read through the filing history of Miller Creek Holdings, the 15-year-old diversion permit, the geological survey confirming original creek flow, the restored irrigation records showing exactly how much productivity had returned to Holt land in a matter of weeks, once water was allowed to move where it always should have. Nolan Van sat near the back, his face gone the color of old paper, saying nothing as the board voted unanimously to restore full historic water rights to the Holt property and refer the original diversion filing for further review. Harlan Dietz, 3 rows from Vera, stared at the folder of soil results being passed hand to hand, results showing land he called worthless testing among the richest in the valley, and found, for maybe the first time in his life, that he had nothing to say. Vera didn't gloat. She didn't need to. She simply stood, thanked the board, and walked out into the parking lot, where afternoon light fell gold across a town only now beginning to understand what it had almost let slip away. They laughed because all they could see was what the land had become, Grant said to her afterward, standing beside his truck in that same lot where all of this had started. Nobody bothered asking what it used to be or what it still could be, if somebody cared enough to look. Vera looked out toward the ridge where Tom was buried, toward fields that were, for the first time in years, genuinely green. I stopped being able to see it myself, she admitted. Somewhere in all the debt and the exhaustion, I just started believing them. Land doesn't lie, Grant said. People do, sometimes on purpose. Sometimes just because they've never learned to look past the surface of a thing. A year later, the Holt farm looked like a different property entirely, though it was really the same 92 acres, simply returned to what it had always been capable of becoming. The cattle herd had grown back. The old holding pond fed the gravity system just as it had a century before. Caleb, 17 now, had started entering his own soil and crop notes into county competitions, and 2 neighboring farms had already asked for his help. Grant still came by most weeks, less as a rescuer now, more as a neighbor, sharing equipment, arguing good-naturedly over the best wheat to plant. Harlan Dietz, to his quiet credit, became one of Vera's regular apple stand customers, and never once used the word worthless in her hearing again. The land had never actually failed anyone. It had simply been waiting for someone patient enough to ask why it was struggling, instead of deciding it was already done. What do you think? Would you have given up on land like this, or held on the way Vera did? Let us know where you're watching from. And if this one moved you, share it with someone who needs a reminder that being underestimated is never the same as being finished.